Hello there, people of the internet. So history lesson time. I was asked by a younger gentleman to go ahead and talk about why this happened. So many years ago, before smokeless powder was a thing and black powder was the predominant gunpowder that was being used here on planet Earth, people were using large caliber projectiles. They were sending large pieces of lead downrange. Typically, for black powder, if we're talking about full power rifles, we're going to talk about anywhere from 10 to 13 millimeters from a military perspective, anywhere from 10 to 13 millimeters of lead being launched downrange with these black powder rifles. And that's simply because black powder just does not generate it cannot launch projectiles as effectively as smokeless powder can. So the speed limit of black powder whenever it launches projectiles tends to be around 1,400 feet per second. That's like really maxing out with black powder firearms. Well, if you can't send a piece of lead faster, then you would simply make that piece of lead larger in order to increase the amount of energy transfer it has on its target. After all, if you increase the size of something, if you double the size of something, you increase its force on target by double. However, whenever smokeless powder comes out, it is able to produce velocities dramatically faster than black powder ever would be able to. So as a result, people start relying, military forces start relying on cartridges that produce speed rather than mass. If you double a projectile's velocity, you don't double its force on target, you quadruple it. So there's a tremendous amount of power being put on a target from a faster projectile in comparison to a heavier projectile. So in order to achieve faster speeds with their projectiles, military forces moved into using smaller bore projectiles. They went from using 10 to 13 millimeters, somewhere in there, most countries, to using anywhere from, like, most countries would adopt either a 7 to an 8 millimeter, with some countries adopting a 6.5 millimeter, and rare occasions you'd see 6 millimeter adoption, but most part 7 to 10 millimeter, and then a couple of 6.5 millimeters, and then rare 6 millimeters. We're going to go ahead and focus from 7 to 10 millimeters because those are definitely the most predominant cartridges that you're going to find around the world. There are quite a few countries that use 6.5 millimeters, so those are definitely viable for this argument. Very rarely did countries adopt anything lower than 6.5 millimeter. But anyway, these smaller, lighter weight bullets not only had flatter trajectories, but since they were lighter weight, they were able to achieve even faster velocities. Whenever I tell people that lighter weight bullets go faster than heavier bullets, a lot of people kind of scratch their head and they're like, how? And I just kind of tell them, well, pick up a small rock and a heavy rock, throw the small rock, see how fast it goes, throw the heavy rock with the same amount of force, see how fast that goes, and yeah, the small rock is going to go faster than the heavy rock simply because it's easier to throw. So countries were trying to figure out a good median between having a large, they wanted a bullet that was smaller than what they were using and small enough to be able to launch at good velocities out of their firearms, but large enough to still have a good impact on target. Many countries that adopted a 6.5 millimeter cartridge at the turn of the century, whenever black powder was replaced by smokeless powder, they tended to want to reach a 30 caliber projectile. The 30 caliber seemed to be like a good golden standard for most of the countries with what they were looking for. So a lot of countries, basically all the countries besides like one or two that adopted a 6.5, eventually moved on to adopting a larger version of a projectile, even though the larger version is gonna have not as much ballistic capabilities as the earlier 6.5 bullet. It's just going to have more impact onto target. Now, countries back whenever this was happening, they were under the impression that combat would be taking place at farther distances than what combat was actually taking place at. Originally, like black powder, originally black powder combat distances were anywhere from like 50 to 150 to 200 yards, simply because that was what the range was allowed with these rifles. Well, now smokeless powder, you don't have everyone getting blind with clouds of smoke in the air. Not only that, but you have faster, flatter shooting projectiles that are just able to hit more accurately out at long distances. And a lot of these rifles, like some of the rifles, were zeroed for a minimum of 400 yards, and governments were just convinced that nobody would ever be getting any closer than that. So you have yourself a 400-yard zero. And a lot of these rifles had like volley sights and whatnot that could effectively fire out to like 3 kilometers away, which is absolutely astonishing at how far governments thought that combat was going to be taking place out. Most combat in a wartime situation would be like between 1 and 300 yards. So having your extremely flat shooting projectiles, unless we're talking about like designated marksmen or people like that, was not necessarily all that important upon the adoption of these rifles. And during the adoption of these rifles, the idea of having a designated marksman wasn't really a thing. Scoped rifles didn't really exist until World War I, where the sniper really started to become predominant on the battlefield. That's a lesson for another video. But typically countries would adopt, let me turn this on real quick, fantastic. Typically countries would adopt anywhere from a 7mm to an 8mm. And one of the more predominant rifles in European powers was the Mauser, and it even got so popular that America adopted it as the 1903 Springfield, but that's another lesson for another time. With Mauser, there were 2 main cartridges that people typically gravitated towards. You had the 8mm Mauser and the 7mm Mauser. There was other cartridges as well, like 7.65 Argentine. That was also a pretty common caliber during that time period, and then every country, there were some countries that wanted like their own proprietary round. But for the most part, 7mm and 8mm Mauser were like the standard Mauser cartridges. And it was all about whether or not you wanted, something lighter weight, flatter shooting, good trajectory, powerful enough to handle what it is that you have to handle, or if you wanted like a larger diameter, extremely powerful round. 8mm Mauser tends to be around a 155 grain projectile or a 198 grain projectile. I have no idea for 7mm Mauser. This is a 140 grain projectile, and it's a commercial load. I'm not sure what the military loadings were like back in the day. But the countries at the time period were trying to get rid of their old school, obsolete black powder rifles, trading off for these newer, much faster, much more capable cartridges. Personally, I really like the 8mm Mauser, but after just seeing the capabilities of 7mm Mauser, I just love them both so much. It's hard to really pick a favorite. 7mm Mauser definitely kicks less than the 8mm for obvious reason, and it definitely has a better trajectory, a better ballistic capability than the 8mm Mauser, especially if we're talking about lighter weight projectiles. And it's just such a delightful round to fire. I really like the 7mm Mauser. And a lot of countries during the time period were seeing this as well, and they were going from like 13mm arm breaking recoil 500 grain projectiles to these little tiny bullets, and they could carry a lot more ammunition carrying that stuff than they were able to with the black powder stuff. And they were able to use significantly less powder too. Whenever we're talking about black powder, you measure that out by volume instead of by weight like you do with this stuff, and just you need significantly less powder with smokeless powder than you do with black powder. The Mauser rifle definitely became a very dominant rifle over there in European powers. Whenever the 88 Commission rifle came out, and eventually the 91 Mauser rifle came out, that right there was like the real hammering point for the 8mm Mauser cartridge. The 1891 Mauser rifle definitely really took off. Then the 93 pattern took off with like Turkey and the Spanish. And then the 95 pattern, that saw some pretty good success, but the 1898 Mauser rifle was so unbelievably successful. It was like a universal rifle all around the world. Chambered in 8mm or 7mm, both of those. Typically, the 7mm Mauser is going to be your 1893 pattern, and your 8mm Mauser is going to be your 1898 pattern. But that's just typically what you find. With how many Mausers that are out there, more often than not, you're going to find that rule to be not set in stone. I guess that's what I'm trying to say here. So this is a 98 pattern Mauser in 8mm. Let's send it around at this downrange. Ow. wow, that recoil is so much harsher. Of course, it doesn't have to be specifically 7mm or 8mm. I got 7.62 by 54 rimmed, which is actually a 3.11 diameter projectile or a 3.12 diameter projectile. So Russia's version of 7.62 is different than NATO's version of 7.62, which is a 3.08 diameter projectile. So not all 7.62 cartridges are the same, despite the fact that they have the same nomenclature, and there's a whole slew of confusion that goes on with that right there. And I don't really want to get into that. Matter of fact, I think I've already made a video talking about the annoyance of that right there. I'll have to go back and double check on my channel if I have made that or not. And if I haven't, I'll probably make that. But this right here is another example of a small bore cartridge traveling really fast that has quite the impact on target and on my shoulder. But yeah, that's why countries went to smaller projectiles instead of using their larger projectiles. Whenever you think about it, they just wanted faster moving projectiles. Now, people ask me, why not just have a larger projectile that also moves fast? And yeah, that's 100% something that happens. Look at the 50 BMG, 50 caliber projectile traveling really fast, 660 grain bullet. But at the same time, something like that, just the amount of pressures that generates and the amount of force that has onto target, like the general foot soldier would not need a rifle that is that powerful. That's definitely like an anti-material rifle. It's a rifle that has a specialty purpose versus just standard infantry use, where something like this would absolutely be adequately powerful. As a matter of fact, this is actually too powerful for infantry use, which is why a lot of countries went to intermediate caliber cartridges, and that's a story for another video. As a matter of fact, I'm sure I've made a video on that one. Anyway, folks, hopefully you learned something today. Thanks for watching. Appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check that out. You guys go off. Have yourself a fantastic day. I'll see you all in the next episode. Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garrett. It's a shame that bolt-action shotguns aren't more mainstream.